What would you do if you were sitting in a diner, minding your own business, and suddenly a group of strangers decided to make you the target of their hate? Imagine the fear, the anger, and the confusion. Now, imagine if those strangers had no idea who they were messing with. This is the story of a man who faced exactly that, a man who looked like an easy target, but was anything but. So, grab a seat, and let's dive into this gripping tale. But before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the small diner as a heavy ceramic mug hit the floor. The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the jukebox in the corner. All eyes turned to the corner booth, where a large black man sat, his broad shoulders hunched over a plate of pancakes. His face was calm, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, darted toward the group of men who had just walked in. They were loud, obnoxious, and reeked of trouble. Their leather jackets bore patches with symbols that made the other diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. The leader of the group, a tall, wiry man with a shaved head and a sneer plastered across his face, locked eyes with the black man. Well, he said, his voice dripping with venom. Looks like we got ourselves a big one, boys. His gang chuckled, their laughter cold and mocking. The black man didn't flinch. He simply wiped his mouth with a napkin and set it down neatly on the table. His name was Marcus Johnson, and he had seen worse than this, much worse. But the gang didn't know that. They didn't know he was a former Navy SEAL, a man who had faced death more times than he could count. To them, he was just a fat black man in a diner, an easy target for their hatred. The leader sauntered over, his boots clacking against the tiled floor. He stopped right in front of Marcus's table, his shadow looming over him. "You're in our spot," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Why don't you move your fat ass somewhere else?" Marcus looked up slowly, his gaze steady. "I was here first," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Why don't you find another seat?" The gang leader's face twisted in anger. He leaned down, his face inches from Marcus's. "You think you're tough? Huh? You think you can talk to me like that?" He reached out and flicked Marcus's plate, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound made everyone in the diner jump, but Marcus didn't move a muscle. The tension in the room was palpable. The other diners held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The gang leader's friends gathered behind him, their fists clenched, ready for a fight. Marcus, still seated, glanced around the room, taking in the situation. He knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew something they didn't. He had trained for moments like this. "Last chance," the gang leader spat. "Get out of here before we make you." Marcus sighed, as if he were dealing with a misbehaving child rather than a dangerous criminal. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his massive frame towering over the gang leader. The room seemed to shrink as he rose to his full height. For the first time, the gang leader looked unsure, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "You want to do this?" Marcus asked, his voice still calm, but with an edge that sent a shiver down the spines of everyone in the room. "You really want to do this?" The gang leader hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He swung his fist, aiming for Marcus's face. But Marcus was faster. He caught the man's wrist mid-swing, his grip like iron. The gang leader's eyes widened in shock as Marcus twisted his arm, forcing him to his knees. The other gang members lunged forward, but Marcus was ready. He moved with a speed and precision that belied his size, disarming one man with a swift kick to the chest and using another's momentum to send him crashing into a table. The diner erupted into chaos as plates and glasses flew through the air. The other customers scrambled for cover, some screaming, others frozen in fear. But Marcus wasn't done. He grabbed the gang leader by the collar and lifted him off the ground, his face inches from the man's. "You picked the wrong guy to mess with," he growled. "Now, you going to tell me who sent you, or this is going to get a whole lot worse?" The gang leader's bravado was gone, replaced by sheer terror. He stammered, trying to form words, but before he could answer, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police were on their way, but Marcus knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As he released the gang leader and stepped back, Marcus's mind raced. This wasn't just a random attack. There was something bigger going on, something dangerous, and he was right in the middle of it. The police burst through the door, their guns drawn. Marcus raised his hands, his face calm, but his mind already working on his next move. He knew this was just the beginning. The gang had underestimated him, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. And neither would he. As the officers handcuffed the gang members and began questioning the witnesses, Marcus stood quietly, his eyes scanning the room. He knew the fight was far from over. In fact, it was just getting started. What will happen next? Will Marcus uncover the truth behind the gang's attack? Or will he find himself in even greater danger? Stay tuned for the next chapter, where the stakes get higher and the truth begins to unravel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single moment of this gripping story. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cars outside the diner cast an eerie glow through the windows, painting the walls in alternating shades of crimson and cobalt. Marcus stood in the center of the chaos, his hands raised as two officers approached him cautiously. The diner was a wreck, overturned tables, shattered glass, and the remnants of half-eaten meals scattered across the floor. The gang members were being led out in handcuffs, their faces bruised and their earlier bravado replaced with sullen silence. But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, stepped forward. "You're going to need to come with us, sir," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We need to get your statement." Marcus nodded, his face calm, but his mind racing. He knew the drill. He'd been through worse situations, but this one felt different. There was something about the gang's aggression, the way they had targeted him specifically, that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just random racism. It felt personal. As he was led to the police car, Marcus glanced back at the diner. The other customers were huddled together, some crying, others whispering nervously. The waitress who had served him earlier, a petite woman with kind eyes, gave him a small, grateful smile. He nodded in return before ducking into the back seat of the squad car. The ride to the station was quiet. Marcus stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. He replayed the fight in his mind, analyzing every move, every word. The gang leader had said, "You're in our spot." What did that mean? Was it just a territorial thing, or was there more to it? And why had they been so quick to escalate things? Most racists talked a big game, but backed down when confronted. These guys had come ready for a fight. When they arrived at the station, Marcus was led to a small interrogation room. The walls were bare except for a two-way mirror, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He sat down at the table, his posture relaxed but his senses on high alert. He knew how these things worked. He'd been on the other side of the table more times than he could count. The door opened, and the same officer who had brought him in entered, followed by a younger detective with a notepad in hand. The detective introduced himself as Detective Harris and took a seat across from Marcus. "Mr. Johnson," Harris began, flipping open his notepad. "Can you tell us what happened back there?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression calm. "I was having breakfast when those guys came in. They started harassing me, and when I didn't back down, they attacked me. I defended myself." Harris nodded, scribbling in his notepad. "And do you know why they targeted you?" Marcus shook his head. "No idea. They seemed to have a problem with me from the moment they walked in." The detective studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You handled yourself pretty well back there. You have any training?" Marcus hesitated. He didn't like to talk about his past, but he knew the police would find out sooner or later. "I was in the Navy. Did a few tours." Harris raised an eyebrow. "SEAL?" Marcus nodded. "Retired." The detective whistled softly. "That explains a lot. Those guys didn't know who they were messing with, huh?" Marcus didn't respond. He wasn't here to brag. He just wanted to figure out what was going on. Harris leaned forward, his tone more serious now. "Look, Mr. Johnson, I'm going to level with you. We've been keeping an eye on that gang for a while now. They're bad news, drugs, weapons, you name it. But they're usually smarter than this. They don't just pick fights in public places unless they have a reason. Are you sure there's nothing else you can tell us?" Marcus frowned. "Like what?" Harris hesitated, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "We've been hearing rumors about a hit. Someone's been paying these guys to take out specific targets. And the way they came at you, it felt like more than just a random attack." Marcus's stomach tightened. A hit? On him? But why? He hadn't been involved in anything dangerous since he left the Navy. He'd been living a quiet life, keeping to himself. Who'll want him dead? Before he could respond, the door burst open, and another officer rushed in, his face pale. "Detective, you need to see this," he said, holding out a tablet. Harris took the tablet and glanced at the screen. His eyes widened, and he quickly handed it to Marcus. "Is this you?" Marcus looked at the screen and felt a chill run down his spine. It was a photo of him, taken earlier that morning as he left his apartment. The timestamp showed it was just an hour before the diner incident. Underneath the photo was a single line of text: "Target acquired. Proceed as planned." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a random attack. Someone had been watching him. Someone had sent that gang after him. But who? And why? Harris stood up, his expression grim. "Mr. Johnson, I think you might be in more danger than you realize. We need to get you somewhere safe." Marcus shook his head. "No, I'm not running. If someone's after me, I need to find out why." Harris hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but you're going to need to be careful. These guys don't play around." Marcus stood up, his mind already racing with plans. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them sitting in a police station. As he walked out of the interrogation room, he felt a familiar fire ignite in his chest. It was the same fire that had driven him through countless missions in the Navy. He was a SEAL, and SEALs didn't back down from a fight. But as he stepped out into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. Someone was after him, and they weren't going to stop until he was dead. What will Marcus do next? Who is behind the hit, and why are they targeting him? The stakes are higher than ever, and the danger is just beginning. The night air was cool as Marcus stepped out of the police station, his breath visible in the dim glow of the streetlights. The city was quiet, but his mind was anything but. The photo on the tablet, the message about a target, it all pointed to one thing. Someone wanted him dead, and they were willing to go to great lengths to make it happen. But who? And why? Marcus didn't have answers, but he knew where to start. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "This better be important," the voice said. "It's Marcus," he replied, keeping his voice low. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sigh. "Marcus Johnson, I should have known it was you. What kind of trouble are you in this time?" Marcus smirked despite the gravity of the situation. His old friend, Jackhound Thompson, had always had a way of cutting through the nonsense. They'd served together in the SEALs, and if anyone could help him figure out what was going on, it was Hound. "I think someone's put a hit on me," Marcus said. "I need to find out who and why." Hound let out a low whistle. "You don't do things by halves, do you? All right, meet me at the usual spot. And Marcus, watch your back." The line went dead, and Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket. The usual spot was an old bar on the outskirts of town, a place they'd used as a meeting point during their time in the service. It was quiet, out of the way, and most importantly, it was neutral ground. Marcus flagged down a cab and gave the driver the address. As the car sped through the empty streets, he kept an eye on the rearview mirror, watching for any signs that he was being followed. The last thing he needed was another run-in with the gang, or worse, whoever had sent them. When they arrived at the bar, Marcus paid the driver and stepped out onto the cracked pavement. The building looked the same as it had the last time he'd been here, dimly lit with a flickering neon sign that read The Rusty Anchor. He pushed open the door and was greeted by the familiar smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke. The bar was nearly empty, save for a few regulars nursing their drinks at the counter. Marcus scanned the room and spotted Hound sitting in a corner booth, his broad frame hunched over a glass of whiskey. He looked up as Marcus approached, his sharp eyes scanning him from head to toe. "You look like hell," Hound said, sliding a glass of whiskey across the table. "Sit down and tell me what's going on." Marcus sat down and took a sip of the whiskey, the burn helping to steady his nerves. He quickly filled Hound in on everything that had happened: the diner, the gang, the photo, and the message about the hit. Hound listened in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. When Marcus finished, he leaned back in his seat and let out a long breath. "This is bad," Hound said. "Real bad. If someone's gone to the trouble of putting a hit on you, they're not going to stop until the job's done." "I know," Marcus said. "That's why I need your help. I need to find out who's behind this. Hound nodded, his mind already working. All right, here's what we're going to do. First, we need to figure out who's got a grudge against you. You've made a lot of enemies over the years, Marcus. Any of them come to mind? Marcus shook his head. I've been out of the game for years. I haven't had any contact with anyone from my old life. Hound frowned. Then it's someone new. Someone who's got a reason to want you out of the picture. You've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong. Marcus thought for a moment, then shook his head again. No, I've been keeping a low profile. Working odd jobs, staying off the radar. Hound leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Then there's only one explanation. Someone's found out about your past, and they're trying to tie up loose ends. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. You think this is about the mission? Hound nodded grimly. It's the only thing that makes sense. You and I both know there are people out there who'd do anything to keep that operation buried. Marcus's mind raced back to his final mission as a SEAL, a covert operation that had gone sideways, leaving behind a trail of bodies and unanswered questions. The details were classified, but Marcus had always suspected there was more to it than he'd been told. If someone was trying to silence him, it could only mean one thing. The truth was about to come out. We need to move fast, Hound said, breaking Marcus out of his thoughts. If they've already sent one team after you, they'll send another. And next time, they won't make the same mistakes. Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. What's the plan? Hound pulled out a small notebook and began scribbling down names and addresses. I've got a few contacts who might be able to help us. We'll start with them and see if we can piece together who's behind this. But Marcus, you need to be ready for anything. These people play for keeps. Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He'd spent his entire life preparing for moments like this. But as he looked down at the list of names Hound had written, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much bigger than they could handle. The two men finished their drinks and stood up, their faces set with determination. As they stepped out into the night, Marcus felt a familiar sense of purpose settle over him. He was a SEAL, and SEALs didn't run from a fight. Whatever was coming, he was ready. But as they climbed into Hound's truck and sped off into the darkness, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if this was a fight he could win. The stakes were higher than ever, and the enemy was closer than he realized. What will Marcus and Hound uncover as they dig deeper into the mystery? Who is behind the hit, and how far will they go to keep their secrets buried? The danger is mounting, and the truth is closer than ever. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where the stakes get even higher and the fight for survival begins. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single moment of this gripping story. The truck rumbled through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence. Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing as Hound navigated the city with the precision of someone who knew every back alley and side street. They were heading to the first name on Hound's list, a former informant named Eddie Fingers Malone. If anyone had their ear to the ground, it was Eddie. You sure Eddie's still around? Marcus asked, breaking the silence. Hound grunted. Last I heard, he was running a pawn shop on the south side. If he's not there, someone will know where he is. Eddie's the kind of guy who knows how to disappear when he needs to, but he's also the kind of guy who can't stay hidden for long. Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the darkened streets. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every flicker of light felt like a signal. He knew it was just his nerves, but after the day he'd had, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. They pulled up to a small, rundown pawn shop tucked between a laundromat and a boarded-up convenience store. The sign above the door read Malone's Pawn and Trade, but the letters were faded, and half the lights were out. Hound parked the truck around the corner, and the two men approached the shop on foot, their footsteps soft against the cracked pavement. The door was locked, but a faint light glowed from inside. Hound knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 more times, a signal Eddie would recognize. After a moment, the door creaked open, and a wiry man with greasy hair and a nervous twitch peered out. Hound? Eddie's voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in a while. What the hell are you doing here? We need to talk, Hound said, pushing past him into the shop. Marcus followed, closing the door behind them. The shop was cluttered with all manner of junk, old electronics, dusty instruments, and shelves filled with trinkets that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Eddie led them to a small back room, where a single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim light over a table covered in papers and empty coffee cups. "What's this about?" Eddie asked, his eyes darting between Hound and Marcus. "I'm retired, you know. I don't do that kind of work anymore." "This isn't work," Hound said, leaning against the table. "This is personal. Someone's put a hit on Marcus here, and we need to find out who." Eddie's eyes widened, and he took a step back. "A hit? On him? Why are you bringing this to me? I don't know anything about that." "Cut the crap, Eddie," Hound snapped. "You hear everything. If there's a hit out on someone, you know about it. Now, are you going to help us? Or do I have to remind you of all the favors you owe me?" Eddie swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He glanced at Marcus, then back at Hound. All right. I'll see what I can find out. But it's going to cost you." Hound reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash, slapping it down on the table. "That enough to jog your memories?" Eddie eyed the money, then nodded. "Give me an hour. I'll make some calls." While Eddie disappeared into another room, Marcus and Hound waited in silence. The tension in the air was thick, and Marcus couldn't help but feel like they were running out of time. Every second they spent here was another second their enemies had to plan their next move. Finally, Eddie returned, his face pale and his hands shaking. "You're not going to like this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Spit it out," Hound growled. Eddie took a deep breath. "The hit is not just some random gang. It's coming from higher up, way higher up. I don't know who's behind it, but they've got deep pockets and a lot of connections. They've been looking for Marcus for a while now. And they're not the only ones." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean, not the only ones?" Eddie hesitated, then pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Marcus. "This came through my channels a few days ago. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now." Marcus unfolded the paper and felt his blood run cold. It was a grainy photo of him, taken from a distance with a single word written underneath: "Terminate." Hound grabbed the paper and studied it, his jaw tightening. "This is bad. Really bad. If they've got this kind of reach, we're not just dealing with some local thugs. This is organized." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. "We need to find out who's behind this. Fast." Eddie shook his head. "I don't know who's pulling the strings, but I do know one thing. They're not working alone. There's a meeting happening tonight, some big shots from out of town. If you want answers, that's where you'll find them." Hound leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Where?" Eddie hesitated, then scribbled an address on a scrap of paper and handed it to Hound. "But if you go there, you're walking into the lion's den. You understand? These people don't play around." Hound took the paper and stuffed it into his pocket. "We'll take our chances." As they turned to leave, Eddie grabbed Marcus's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Be careful, man. These people, they're dangerous. And they're not just after you. They're after anyone who gets in their way." Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "Thanks for the warning." The two men left the pawn shop and climbed back into the truck. Hound handed Marcus the scrap of paper with the address. "You ready for this?" Marcus stared at the address, his jaw clenched. "I don't have a choice." Hound started the engine and pulled out onto the street. "Then let's go crash a party." The address led them to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. The building was dark and silent, but as they approached, Marcus could see faint lights flickering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. There were cars parked nearby, expensive ones, the kind that didn't belong in a place like this. Hound parked the truck a few blocks away, and the two men approached the warehouse on foot, moving silently through the shadows. As they got closer, they could hear voices, low, murmuring conversations that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. They found a side door and slipped inside, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. The warehouse was filled with crates and machinery, but in the center of the room, a group of men stood around a table, their faces illuminated by the glow of a single overhead light. Marcus recognized one of them immediately, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek. His name was Victor Kane, a former mercenary with a reputation for brutality. Marcus had crossed paths with him years ago, during a mission gone wrong. If Kane was here, It could only mean one thing. This was personal. Hound signaled for Marcus to stay back, but Marcus shook his head. He wasn't going to hide. Not anymore. As they stepped into the light, the men around the table turned, their eyes narrowing as they recognized Marcus. Kane's lips curled into a sneer. Well, Kane said, his voice dripping with malice. Look who decided to show up. Marcus stepped forward, his fists clenched. You've got a lot of nerve, Kane. Coming after me like this. Kane chuckled, a low, menacing sound. You think this is about you? You're just a loose end, Johnson. And loose ends need to be tied up. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted, and the room exploded into chaos. Marcus dove for cover, his training kicking in as he scanned the room for threats. Hound was already moving, his gun drawn as he returned fire. The fight was on, and Marcus knew there was no turning back. Whoever was behind this, they weren't going to stop until he was dead. And Marcus wasn't going down without a fight. The warehouse was a war zone, bullets ricocheting off metal crates and sparks flying as the gunfire lit up the darkness. Marcus and Hound were outnumbered, but they had one advantage. They were trained for this. Every move was calculated, every shot precise. But as the bodies began to fall, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Kane was still standing, his eyes locked on Marcus as he reloaded his gun. You're not walking out of here alive, Johnson, he snarled. Marcus met his gaze, his expression cold. We'll see about that. The two men charged at each other, the sound of their clash drowned out by the chaos around them. This wasn't just a fight, it was a battle for survival. And Marcus wasn't about to lose. The warehouse was a blur of motion and noise. Marcus and Kane collided with the force of two freight trains, their bodies slamming into a stack of crates that toppled over with a deafening crash. Marcus gritted his teeth as pain shot through his shoulder, but he didn't let it slow him down. He swung a fist at Kane's jaw, but the mercenary ducked and countered with a brutal elbow to Marcus's ribs. Kane was fast, faster than Marcus remembered, and his strikes were precise, each one aimed to incapacitate. But Marcus had been through worse. He blocked the next blow and drove his knee into Kane's stomach, forcing the man to stagger back. You've gotten soft, Johnson, Kane spat, wiping blood from his lip. All that time hiding out, living like a civilian, it's made you weak. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't have the luxury of banter. He could hear Hound still exchanging gunfire with Kane's men, and he knew they were running out of time. He needed to end this and fast. Kane lunged again, but this time Marcus was ready. He sidestepped the attack and grabbed Kane's arm, twisting it behind his back and slamming him face first into the wall. Kane grunted in pain, but managed to elbow Marcus in the side, breaking free and spinning around to deliver a vicious kick to Marcus's chest. Marcus stumbled back, gasping for air, but he didn't fall. He couldn't afford to. He charged forward, tackling Kane to the ground, and the two men rolled across the floor, each one fighting for the upper hand. Nearby, Hound was holding his own, but the odds were against him. Kane's men were well-armed and well-trained, and they were closing in. Hound took out two more with precise shots, but he was running low on ammo. Marcus! Hound shouted, tossing him a handgun. We need to move. Marcus caught the gun and fired a shot at Kane, forcing the mercenary to dive for cover. He scrambled to his feet and joined Hound, the two men moving toward the exit as Kane's men regrouped. This way, Hound yelled, leading Marcus through a maze of crates and machinery. They burst out of the warehouse and into the night, the cool air a sharp contrast to the heat of the battle inside. But their escape wasn't going to be that easy. As they ran toward the truck, a black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them, blocking their path. The doors flew open, and more armed men poured out, their guns trained on Marcus and Hound. Down! Marcus shouted, pulling Hound to the ground as bullets whizzed overhead. They crawled behind a stack of pallets, using them as cover as the gunfire continued. We're pinned down, Hound said, his voice tight with frustration. We can't take them all. Marcus clenched his jaw, his mind racing. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but he wasn't about to give up. He glanced around, looking for anything they could use to turn the tide. His eyes landed on a nearby forklift, its keys still in the ignition. "Cover me," Marcus said, handing Hound the gun. "What are you?" Hound started, but Marcus was already moving. He sprinted toward the forklift, dodging bullets as he went. One grazed his arm, but he didn't stop. He jumped into the seat, turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without hesitation, he slammed the forklift into gear and drove it straight toward the SUV. The armed men scattered as the forklift plowed into the side of the vehicle, the impact sending it skidding sideways. Marcus didn't stop there. He reversed the forklift and rammed the SUV again, this time flipping it onto its side. "Let's go," Marcus shouted, jumping out of the forklift and running back to Hound. The two men didn't waste any time. They sprinted to the truck, jumped in, and Hound hit the gas, peeling out of the parking lot just as more SUVs arrived on the scene. "That was too close," Hound said, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as they sped down the road. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his breathing heavy. "We're not out of the woods yet. They'll be after us?" Hound nodded, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "We need to disappear. Lay low for a while until we can figure out our next move." Marcus didn't argue. He knew Hound was right. They had survived the fight, but they were still in danger. Whoever was behind this, they weren't going to stop until Marcus was dead. And now, they knew he was onto them. As the truck sped through the city, Marcus's mind raced. They needed a plan, a way to strike back. But first, they needed to regroup, and they needed to find out who was pulling the strings. The safe house was a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of town. It was one of several locations Hound had set up over the years, a place to lay low when things got too hot. The two men entered quietly, their senses on high alert as they checked the rooms to make sure they were alone. Once they were sure the place was secure, Marcus collapsed onto the couch, his body aching from the fight. Hound handed him a bottle of water and sat down across from him, his expression grim. "We need to figure out who's behind this," Hound said. "And fast. They're not going to stop coming after you." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. Kane said, "I was just a loose end. That means there's something bigger going on. Something they don't want getting out." Hound leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You think this is about the mission? The one that went sideways?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "It's the only thing that makes sense. That mission was classified, but there were too many loose ends. Too many questions. If someone's trying to tie them up, they're not going to stop until everyone involved is dead." Hound's jaw tightened. "Then we need to find out who's left. Who else from that mission is still alive?" Marcus thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't know. Most of the team is gone. But there's one person who might know something." Hound raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Marcus looked at him, his expression serious. "Commander Hayes. He was in charge of the mission. If anyone knows what really happened, it's him." Hound frowned. "Hayes? Last I heard, he retired. Went off the grid." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. If we can find him, we might be able to get some answers." Hound leaned back, his face thoughtful. "All right, we'll start with Hayes. But we need to be careful. If they're watching us, they'll be expecting us to make a move." Marcus didn't respond. He knew the risks, but he also knew they didn't have a choice. Whoever was behind this, they were playing for keeps. And Marcus wasn't about to let them win. The night stretched on, the silence of the safe house a stark contrast to the chaos of the warehouse. Marcus sat by the window, staring out at the darkened streets. His body was exhausted, but his mind was wide awake. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Hound was in the other room, making calls and reaching out to contacts, trying to track down Commander Hayes. Marcus knew it was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. As he sat there, his thoughts drifted back to the mission, the one that had changed everything. He had always suspected there was more to it than he'd been told, but he'd never had the chance to dig deeper. Now, it seemed the past was catching up to him, and if he didn't act fast, it might just kill him. The sound of Hound's voice broke Marcus out of his thoughts. "I've got something." Marcus turned to see Hound standing in the doorway, his phone in hand. "Hayes. He's been spotted. Small town up north. If we leave now, we can be there by morning." Marcus stood up, his exhaustion replaced by a surge of adrenaline. "Then let's go." The two men grabbed their gear and headed for the door. They didn't know what they would find when they reached Hayes, but they knew one thing. The answers they were looking for were out there, and they were running out of time to find them. The truck roared to life, and they sped off into the night, the city lights fading behind them. Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was closer than ever. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He was a SEAL, and SEALs didn't back down from a fight. And this fight was far from over. The drive north was long and tense, the hum of the truck's engine, the only sound breaking the silence. Marcus stared out the window, watching as the city lights faded into the darkness of the countryside. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more troubling than the last. Commander Hayes was their only lead, and if he didn't have the answers they needed, Marcus wasn't sure where else to turn. Hound broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "You think Hayes will talk?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He had served under Hayes for years, and while the man had always been a tough, no-nonsense leader, Marcus had never known him to be dishonest. But that was before the mission, before everything had gone sideways. If Hayes had been involved in covering something up, Marcus wasn't sure how far he could trust him. "I don't know," Marcus finally said. "But he's the only one left who might know what really happened. We have to try." Hound nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "And if he's not willing to talk?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then we'll make him." The rest of the drive passed in silence, the tension in the truck growing with each passing mile. By the time they reached the small town where Hayes had been spotted, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The town was quiet, the streets empty except for a few early risers heading to work. Hound pulled the truck into a parking lot behind a diner and killed the engine. "This is the place," he said, nodding toward a small house across the street. "Hayes has been staying there for the past few weeks. According to my contact, he's been keeping a low profile, no visitors, no phone calls. Just him and his dog." Marcus studied the house, his eyes narrowing. It was a modest place, with a well-kept yard and a porch swing that swayed gently in the morning breeze. It didn't look like the kind of place a former Navy commander would retire to, but then again, Hayes had always been a man of simple tastes. "Let's go," Marcus said, opening the door and stepping out into the cool morning air. The two men crossed the street and approached the house, their footsteps soft against the pavement. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was it, their best chance to get answers. Hound knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. For a moment, there was no response. Then, the sound of footsteps approached, and the door creaked open. Commander Hayes stood in the doorway, his face lined with age, but his eyes as sharp as ever. He looked at Marcus, then at Hound, and his expression hardened. "Johnson," Hayes said, his voice cold. "What the hell are you doing here?" Marcus didn't flinch. "We need to talk." Hayes studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Get inside, before someone sees you." The two men entered the house, and Hayes closed the door behind them. The interior was sparse but tidy, with a few pieces of furniture and a small kitchen. A dog, a German shepherd, watched them from the corner, its ears perked up but its body relaxed. Hayes crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, his eyes narrowing. "You've got 5 minutes. Start talking." Marcus didn't waste any time. "Someone's put a hit on me. They sent a gang after me, and when that didn't work, they sent Victor Kane. They're not going to stop until I'm dead. And I think it's because of the mission." Hayes's expression didn't change, but Marcus could see the tension in his shoulders. "What mission?" "You know damn well what mission," Marcus snapped, his patience wearing thin. "The one that went sideways. The one where half the team didn't make it back. There's something you're not telling us, Hayes. And I need to know what it is." Hayes was silent for a long moment, his eyes locked on Marcus. Then, he let out a long breath and shook his head. "You shouldn't have come here, Johnson. You're digging up things that are better left buried." "I don't have a choice," Marcus said, his voice rising. "They're coming after me, Hayes. And if I don't find out why, I'm dead. So, either you help me, or I'll find someone who will." Hayes stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, he pushed off the wall and walked over to a small desk in the corner. He opened a drawer and pulled out a file, tossing it onto the table. "You want answers?" Hayes said, his voice low. There they are. But I'm warning you, Johnson. Once you open that file, there's no going back. Marcus hesitated, then stepped forward and picked up the file. He opened it, his eyes scanning the documents inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. The file contained classified reports, photographs, and mission logs, all related to the operation that had gone sideways. But there was more. There were names, dates, and locations, evidence of a cover-up that went all the way to the top. Marcus looked up at Hayes, his face pale. What is this? Hayes's expression was grim. The truth. The mission wasn't what you thought it was. It was a setup, a way to eliminate a target without leaving any traces. But something went wrong, and the target got away. The people behind it couldn't risk anyone finding out, so they buried it. And they've been burying it ever since. Marcus felt a surge of anger. And you knew about this? Hayes shook his head. Not at first. I found out after the fact. By then it was too late. They had too much power, too many connections. I tried to expose them, but they shut me down. That's why I retired. That's why I disappeared. Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. Who's behind this? Hayes hesitated, then said, a group called the Syndicate. They're a shadow organization. Powerful, well-funded, and ruthless. They operate outside the law, and they have ties to governments, militaries, and corporations. If they're after you, it's because they think you're a threat. Marcus stared at him, his heart pounding. A threat to what? Hayes's expression darkened. To their secrets, to their power, to everything they've built. And if they think you know something, they'll stop at nothing to silence you. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had always suspected there was more to the mission, but he had never imagined it was something like this. The Syndicate, a name he had never heard before, but one that now filled him with dread. Hound stepped forward, his voice low. What do we do now? Hayes looked at him, then at Marcus. You have two choices. You can walk away, disappear, and hope they forget about you. Or you can fight back. But if you choose the second option, you need to understand something. This isn't just about survival. This is about taking down an organization that's been operating in the shadows for decades. And it's not going to be easy. Marcus didn't hesitate. I'm not running. Hayes nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Then you're going to need help, and you're going to need to move fast. The Syndicate doesn't give second chances. Marcus looked down at the file in his hands, his mind racing. He had the truth now, but it was only the beginning. The Syndicate was out there, and they were coming for him. But Marcus wasn't going to wait for them to strike. He was going to take the fight to them. The three men spent the next few hours going over the file, piecing together what they could about the Syndicate. It was a daunting task. The organization was vast, with tendrils reaching into every corner of the world. But they had one advantage. They knew the Syndicate's weakness. They rely on secrecy, Hayes said, pointing to a map covered in red dots. If we can expose them, we can take them down. But we need evidence, something concrete that can't be ignored. Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the map. Where do we start? Hayes tapped the location on the map, a city not far from where they were. There's a facility here. It's one of their hubs. If we can get inside, we might be able to find what we need. Hound frowned. And how do you propose we do that? Walk in the front door? Hayes shook his head. We'll need a plan, and we'll need to move fast. The Syndicate will be watching, and they'll be expecting us to make a move. Marcus stood up, his expression determined. Then let's get to work. The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. Hayes provided them with everything they needed: weapons, equipment, and intelligence. But even with his help, the odds were against them. The Syndicate's facility was heavily guarded, and getting inside would be nearly impossible. But Marcus wasn't about to let that stop him. He had faced impossible odds before, and he had always found a way to come out on top. This time would be no different. As they prepared to leave, Hayes pulled Marcus aside. Be careful, Johnson. The Syndicate doesn't play fair, and they're not going to let you walk away. Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched. I know, but I'm not going to let them win. Hayes studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good luck. The facility loomed in the distance, a massive structure surrounded by high walls and armed guards. Marcus and Hound crouched in the shadows, their eyes scanning the perimeter. This is it, Hound said, his voice low. "You ready?" Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. "Let's do this." The two men moved forward, their movements silent and precise. They had a plan, but they both knew it was a long shot. The syndicate was waiting for them, and they were walking right into the lion's den. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He was a SEAL, and SEALs didn't back down from a fight. And this fight was just beginning. The night was thick with tension as Marcus and Hound approached the syndicate facility. The high walls and razor wire glinted under the pale moonlight, and the faint hum of security cameras scanning the perimeter sent a chill down Marcus's spine. This wasn't just a facility, it was a fortress, and they were about to break into it. Hound crouched low beside Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper. "Remember the plan. We go in quiet, grab what we need, and get out. No heroics." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the guard patrolling the nearest gate. "Got it. Let's move." The two men slipped through the shadows, their movements silent and deliberate. They had spent hours studying the facility's layout, thanks to Hayes' intel, and they knew exactly where to go. The first obstacle was the outer wall, but Marcus had come prepared. He pulled a small grappling hook from his pack and launched it over the wall, the hook catching securely on the other side. He tested the line, then began to climb, Hound following close behind. Once over the wall, they dropped into a crouch, scanning the area for guards. The facility was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of machinery in the distance. Marcus signaled to Hound, and the two men moved toward the main building, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the security cameras. They reached a side door, and Marcus pulled out a set of lockpicks. It took him less than a minute to bypass the lock, and the door clicked open. They slipped inside, the dim light of the hallway casting long shadows on the walls. The interior of the facility was just as imposing as the exterior. The walls were lined with security cameras, and the air was thick with the smell of chemicals. Marcus and Hound moved quickly but cautiously, their eyes scanning for any signs of movement. "This way," Marcus whispered, leading Hound down a narrow corridor. According to Hayes' intel, the facility server room was located on the lower level, and that's where they would find the evidence they needed. They reached a stairwell and descended quietly, their footsteps barely making a sound. The lower level was even darker, the air cooler and damp. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to stay focused. They were close. The server room was at the end of the hallway, its heavy steel door guarded by a keypad. Marcus pulled out a small device and attached it to the keypad, the screen lighting up as it began to crack the code. It took a few tense seconds, but the device beeped and the door clicked open. Inside, the room was filled with rows of servers, their lights blinking in the darkness. Marcus and Hound moved quickly, searching for the main terminal. They found it in the center of the room, a large console with multiple monitors. "This is it," Marcus said, pulling a flash drive from his pocket and plugging it into the console. The screen lit up, and he began to download the files. The progress bar moved slowly, each second feeling like an eternity. Hound kept watch by the door, his gun drawn and his eyes scanning the hallway. "Hurry up," he whispered. "We don't have much time." Marcus didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the screen. The files were almost done downloading when he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps approaching. "We've got company," Hound said, his voice tense. Marcus glanced at the progress bar. Just a few more seconds. The footsteps grew louder, and Hound tightened his grip on his gun. "Marcus!" "Got it," Marcus said, yanking the flash drive out of the console just as the door burst open. Two armed guards rushed in, their guns raised. Hound fired first, taking out one guard with a clean shot to the chest. The second guard ducked behind a server, returning fire. Bullets ricocheted off the metal, and Marcus dove for cover. "We need to move," Hound shouted, firing another shot at the guard. Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet and bolted for the door, Hound covering him as they retreated. More guards were coming, their shouts echoing through the hallway. The two men sprinted back the way they had come, their footsteps pounding against the floor. Marcus could hear the guards behind them, their voices growing louder. They reached the stairwell and took the steps two at a time, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. "This way!" Hound yelled, leading Marcus down a different corridor. They burst through a door and found themselves in a loading dock, the cool night air hitting them like a slap in the face. But their escape wasn't going to be that easy. A group of guards was waiting for them, their guns trained on the two men. "Drop your weapons," one of the guards shouted. Marcus and Hound exchanged a glance, their minds racing. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they weren't about to give up. Marcus tightened his grip on the flash drive, the weight of it in his hand a reminder of what was at stake. "On my mark," Hound whispered. Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. "Now!" The two men dove in opposite directions, rolling behind crates as the guards opened fire. Bullets whizzed past them, and Marcus returned fire, taking out one guard with a well-placed shot. Hound took out another, but there were still too many of them. "We need to get out of here," Marcus shouted, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. Hound nodded, his eyes scanning the area. "There," he said, pointing to a parked truck near the edge of the dock. Marcus didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the truck, Hound covering him as he went. He jumped into the driver's seat and hot-wired the engine, the truck roaring to life. Hound climbed into the passenger seat, and Marcus hit the gas, the tires screeching as they sped out of the loading dock. The guards fired after them, but the truck was already out of range. Marcus drove like a man possessed, weaving through the narrow streets and putting as much distance between them and the facility as possible. Hound leaned back in his seat, his breathing heavy. "That was too close." Marcus didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the road. They had the files, but they weren't out of the woods yet. The syndicate would be after them, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. The safe house was a small, run-down apartment on the edge of town. Marcus and Hound entered quietly, their senses on high alert. They knew the syndicate would be looking for them, and they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Marcus plugged the flash drive into a laptop and began to sift through the files. What he found made his blood run cold. The syndicate was involved in everything: illegal arms deals, human trafficking, even assassinations. But the most damning evidence was a list of names. High-ranking officials, politicians, and military leaders who were either working for the syndicate or being blackmailed by them. "This is bigger than we thought," Marcus said, his voice grim. Hound leaned over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the screen. "We need to get this to someone who can do something about it. But who can we trust?" Marcus didn't answer right away. The syndicate's reach was vast, and they had infiltrated every level of government. Trusting the wrong person could mean the end of them. "Hayes," Marcus finally said. "He's the only one we can trust." Hound nodded. "Then let's get this to him. But we need to move fast. The syndicate will be after us, and they're not going to stop until they get that flash drive." Marcus didn't respond. He knew the risks, but he also knew they didn't have a choice. The syndicate had to be stopped, and they were the only ones who could do it. The drive back to Hayes' house was tense, the weight of the flash drive heavy in Marcus's pocket. He could feel the syndicate's presence like a shadow, lurking just out of sight. But he wasn't afraid. He was a SEAL, and SEALs didn't back down from a fight. And this fight was far from over. The safe house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the laptop as Marcus and Hound pored over the files they had stolen from the syndicate facility. The evidence was damning. Names, dates, locations, and transactions that painted a picture of an organization so vast and powerful it was almost incomprehensible. But Marcus knew they couldn't afford to be overwhelmed. They had to act, and they had to act fast. "We need to get this to Hayes," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "He's the only one who can help us expose this." Hound nodded, his expression grim. "Agreed. But we can't just waltz back to his place. The syndicate will be watching him, and they'll be watching us. We need a plan." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had one advantage. They knew the syndicate's secrets. If they could stay one step ahead, they might just have a chance. "We'll need a distraction," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing as an idea began to form. Something big enough to draw their attention away from Hayes. Hound raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood up and began to pace, his thoughts swirling. The syndicate was powerful, but they weren't invincible. They had weaknesses, and Marcus was determined to exploit them. "We hit them where it hurts," Marcus finally said. Their money. If we can disrupt their operations, even for a little while, it'll give us the time we need to get the evidence to Hayes. Hound frowned. And how do you propose we do that? We're not exactly flush with resources. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face Hound. We don't need resources. We just need to be smart. The syndicate has a lot of moving parts. Illegal arms deals, drug shipments, money laundering. If we can disrupt one of those operations, it'll create chaos. And chaos is exactly what we need. Hound considered this for a moment, then nodded. All right, let's do it. But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more time they have to come after us. Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the laptop and began to search through the files, looking for something they could use. It didn't take long for him to find it. A shipping manifest for a large container ship scheduled to dock at a nearby port in less than 24 hours. The manifest listed the contents as agricultural equipment, but Marcus knew better. The syndicate was using the ship to transport illegal weapons, and if they could intercept it, they could deal a major blow to the organization. This is it, Marcus said, pointing to the screen. We hit the ship. If we can take out the cargo, it'll cripple their operations in this region. Hound studied the manifest, his eyes narrowing. It's risky. The port will be heavily guarded, and we'll be outnumbered. Marcus nodded. I know, but it's our best shot. And if we can pull it off, it'll give us the time we need to get the evidence to Hayes. Hound didn't argue. He knew Marcus was right. They didn't have a lot of options, and this was the best one they had. All right, let's do it. The port was a sprawling complex of warehouses, cranes, and shipping containers, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel. Marcus and Hound approached from the water, using a small boat they had borrowed from a local fisherman. The plan was simple. Sneak onto the ship, plant explosives on the cargo, and get out before anyone noticed. But simple didn't mean easy. The ship loomed in the distance, its massive hull lit up by the harsh glow of floodlights. Marcus could see guards patrolling the deck, their silhouettes stark against the night sky. He and Hound moved silently through the water, their boat barely making a ripple as they approached the ship. Ready? Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. Hound nodded, his expression grim. Let's do this. They tied the boat to the ship's anchor chain and began to climb, their movements slow and deliberate. The climb was treacherous, the metal chain slick with seawater, but they made it to the deck without incident. They dropped onto the deck and crouched low, their eyes scanning for guards. This way, Marcus whispered, leading Hound toward the cargo hold. They moved quickly but quietly, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the floodlights. The ship was massive, and it took them several minutes to reach the cargo hold. The hold was filled with shipping containers, each one marked with the syndicate's logo. Marcus pulled out a small device and began scanning the containers, looking for the ones that contained the weapons. It didn't take long for him to find them, a row of containers near the back of the hold. Here, Marcus said, pointing to the containers. We plant the explosives here. It'll take out the entire shipment. Hound nodded and began setting the charges, his movements precise and efficient. Marcus kept watch, his eyes scanning the hold for any signs of movement. The air was thick with tension, and every sound made his heart race. They were almost done when Marcus heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to Hound and held up a hand, signaling for him to stop. The footsteps grew louder, and Marcus could see the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. We've got company, Marcus whispered, his voice tense. Hound didn't respond. He finished setting the last charge and moved to Marcus's side, his gun drawn. The two men crouched behind a stack of crates, their eyes fixed on the approaching guard. The guard stopped a few feet away, his flashlight sweeping the area. Marcus held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger of his gun. The guard hesitated, then turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Let's get out of here. Hound nodded, and the two men moved quickly toward the exit. They were almost there when the alarm sounded, a loud, blaring siren that echoed through the ship. They know we're here, Hound shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Marcus didn't respond. He grabbed Hound's arm, and pulled him toward the nearest stairwell. They sprinted up the stairs, the sound of shouting and footsteps close behind. The ship was coming alive, guards pouring out of every doorway. They reached the deck and ran toward the edge, the sound of gunfire ringing out behind them. Marcus didn't stop. He grabbed the anchor chain and began to climb down, Hound right behind him. Bullets whizzed past them, but they didn't stop. They reached the boat and jumped in, Marcus hitting the throttle as soon as they were clear. The boat roared to life, speeding away from the ship just as the explosives detonated. The night sky lit up with a brilliant flash, followed by a deafening boom that shook the water. Marcus glanced back and saw the ship engulfed in flames, the cargo hold completely destroyed. "We did it," Hound said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. Marcus didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the water, his mind already racing ahead. They had dealt a blow to the syndicate, but the fight was far from over. The organization would be coming for them, and they needed to be ready. The safe house was quiet when they returned, the tension in the air almost palpable. Marcus plugged the flash drive into the laptop and began to upload the files to a secure server. They needed to get the evidence to Hayes, but they couldn't risk meeting him in person. "Not yet. We'll send him the files," Marcus said, his voice low. "Once he has them, he can start exposing the syndicate. But we need to stay hidden. If they find us before the evidence goes public, it's over." Hound nodded, his expression grim. "Agreed. But we can't stay here forever. The syndicate will be looking for us, and they'll find us eventually." Marcus didn't respond. He knew Hound was right. They were running out of time, and they needed to make their next move soon. But for now, they had done what they set out to do. They had struck a blow against the syndicate, and they had the evidence they needed to bring them down. The fight wasn't over, but they were one step closer to victory. The night stretched on, the silence of the safe house a stark contrast to the chaos of the port. Marcus sat by the window, staring out at the darkened streets. His body was exhausted, but his mind was wide awake. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Hound was in the other room, making calls and reaching out to contacts, trying to track down Hayes. Marcus knew it was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. As he sat there, his thoughts drifted back to the mission, the one that had changed everything. He had always suspected there was more to it than he'd been told, but he'd never had the chance to dig deeper. Now, it seemed, the past was catching up to him, and if he didn't act fast, it might just kill him. The sound of Hound's voice broke Marcus out of his thoughts. "I've got something." Marcus turned to see Hound standing in the doorway, his phone in hand. "Hayes! He's been spotted. Small town up north. If we leave now, we can be there by morning." Marcus stood up, his exhaustion replaced by a surge of adrenaline. "Then let's go." The two men grabbed their gear and headed for the door. They didn't know what they would find when they reached Hayes, but they knew one thing. The answers they were looking for were out there, and they were running out of time to find them. The truck roared to life, and they sped off into the night, the city lights fading behind them. Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was closer than ever. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He was a SEAL, and SEALs didn't back down from a fight. And this fight was far from over. The drive to the small town where Hayes had been spotted was tense and quiet. Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing as the countryside blurred past. The syndicate was still out there, and they would be coming for him. But Marcus wasn't running anymore. He was done hiding. It was time to face this head-on. Hound broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "You think Hayes will be able to help us?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Hayes had always been a man of few words, but he was also a man of action. If anyone could help them expose the syndicate, it was him. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. "He's our best shot," Marcus finally said. "But we need to be careful. The syndicate will be watching him." Hound nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "Then we'll have to move fast." The town came into view as the sun began to rise, its small buildings and quiet streets bathed in the soft light of dawn. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers stuck out like sore thumbs. Marcus and Hound parked the truck on the outskirts of town and approached on foot, their senses on high alert. Hayes's house was a modest cabin on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and a small fence. Marcus could see smoke rising from the chimney, a sign that someone was home. He and Hound approached cautiously, their eyes scanning for any signs of movement. Marcus knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet morning. For a moment, there was no response. Then, the door creaked open, and Hayes stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Johnson," Hayes said, his voice cold. "What are you doing here?" Marcus didn't flinch. "We need your help." Hayes studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Get inside, before someone sees you." The two men entered the cabin, and Hayes closed the door behind them. The interior was sparse but tidy, with a small kitchen and a few pieces of furniture. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room. Hayes crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, his eyes narrowing. "You've got 5 minutes. Start talking." Marcus didn't waste any time. He pulled the flash drive from his pocket and handed it to Hayes. "We hit one of the syndicate's operations. This is everything we found." Hayes took the flash drive and plugged it into a laptop, his eyes scanning the screen as the files loaded. His expression grew darker with each passing second. "This is bad," he said, his voice low. "Really bad." "We know," Marcus said. "That's why we need your help. We need to expose them before it's too late." Hayes was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the screen. Then, he let out a long breath and shook his head. "You don't understand what you're up against. The syndicate isn't just some criminal organization. They're everywhere in governments, militaries, corporations. If you go after them, you're going to be fighting the whole damn system." Marcus didn't respond. He knew the risks, but he also knew they didn't have a choice. The syndicate had to be stopped, and they were the only ones who could do it. "We're not backing down," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Not this time." Hayes studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. We need to hit them where it hurts, their money, their power, their reputation. And we need to do it fast." Marcus and Hound exchanged a glance, then nodded. "What's the plan?" Hound asked. Hayes leaned forward, his expression grim. "The syndicate has a meeting tonight, a gathering of their top leaders. If we can get to them, we can take them all out in one fell swoop." Marcus frowned. "And how do you propose we do that?" Hayes didn't answer right away. He pulled out a map and spread it on the table, pointing to a location near the coast. "They're meeting here, an old mansion on the cliffs. It's heavily guarded, but if we can get inside, we can take them down." Marcus studied the map, his mind racing. It was a risky plan, but it was their best shot. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's do it." The mansion loomed in the distance, its imposing silhouette stark against the night sky. Marcus, Hound, and Hayes approached from the cliffs, their movements silent and deliberate. The plan was simple. Sneak in, take out the guards, and confront the syndicate's leaders. But simple didn't mean easy. The mansion was surrounded by high walls and armed guards, their silhouettes visible against the floodlights. Marcus and Hound moved quickly, using the cover of darkness to get closer. Hayes stayed behind, providing cover and keeping watch. Marcus and Hound reached the wall and began to climb, their movements slow and deliberate. The climb was treacherous, the stones slick with moss, but they made it to the top without incident. They dropped onto the other side and crouched low, their eyes scanning for guards. "This way," Marcus whispered, leading Hound toward the mansion. They moved quickly, but quietly, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the floodlights. The mansion was massive, and it took them several minutes to reach the main building. The door was locked, but Marcus made quick work of the lock with his picks. They slipped inside, the dim light of the hallway casting long shadows on the walls. The interior was opulent, with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but Marcus didn't have time to admire the decor. They needed to find the syndicate's leaders, and they needed to do it fast. They moved through the mansion, their footsteps silent against the marble floors. The sound of voices led them to a large room at the end of the hallway. Marcus peeked through the door and saw a group of men sitting around a table, their faces illuminated by the glow of a single overhead light. "That's them," Marcus whispered, his voice tense. "The syndicate's leaders." Hound nodded, his expression grim. "Let's take them out." Marcus didn't respond. He pulled out his gun and stepped into the room, Hound right behind him. The men at the table looked up, their expressions a mix of shock and anger. "Who the hell are you?" one of the men demanded, his voice filled with rage. Marcus didn't answer. He raised his gun and fired, the sound of the shot echoing through the room. The man slumped forward, his body hitting the table with a thud. The other men scrambled to their feet, their hands reaching for their guns. But Marcus and Hound were faster. They moved with precision, taking out the syndicate's leaders one by one. The room was filled with the sound of gunfire and shouting, but Marcus didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. When the last man fell, Marcus lowered his gun, his breathing heavy. The room was silent, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. It was over. The syndicate's leaders were dead. But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. The syndicate was vast, and there were still others out there. But they had dealt a major blow, and they had the evidence they needed to expose the organization. The safe house was quiet when they returned, the tension in the air almost palpable. Marcus plugged the flash drive into the laptop and began to upload the files to a secure server. They needed to get the evidence out, but they couldn't risk meeting Hayes in person. "Not yet. We'll send him the files," Marcus said, his voice low. "Once he has them, he can start exposing the syndicate. But we need to stay hidden. If they find us before the evidence goes public, it's over." Hound nodded, his expression grim. "Agreed. But we can't stay here forever. The syndicate will be looking for us, and they'll find us eventually." Marcus didn't respond. He knew Hound was right. They were running out of time, and they needed to make their next move soon. But for now, they had done what they set out to do. They had struck a blow against the syndicate, and they had the evidence they needed to bring them down. The fight wasn't over, but they were one step closer to victory. The night stretched on, the silence of the safe house a stark contrast to the chaos of the mansion. Marcus sat by the window, staring out at the darkened streets. His body was exhausted, but his mind was wide awake. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Hound was in the other room, making calls and reaching out to contacts, trying to track down Hayes. Marcus knew it was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had. As he sat there, his thoughts drifted back to the mission, the one that had changed everything. He had always suspected there was more to it than he'd been told, but he'd never had the chance to dig deeper. Now it seemed the past was catching up to him, and if he didn't act fast, it might just kill him. The sound of Hound's voice broke Marcus out of his thoughts. "I've got something?" Marcus turned to see Hound standing in the doorway, his phone in hand. "Hayes. He's been spotted. Small town up north. If we leave now, we could be there by morning." Marcus stood up, his exhaustion replaced by a surge of adrenaline. "Then let's go." The two men grabbed their gear and headed for the door. They didn't know what they would find when they reached Hayes, but they knew one thing. The answers they were looking for were out there, and they were running out of time to find them. The truck roared to life, and they sped off into the night, the city lights fading behind them. Marcus stared out the window, his mind racing. The stakes were higher than ever, and the danger was closer than ever. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He was a SEAL, and SEALs didn't back down from a fight. And this fight was far from over. The drive to the small town where Hayes had been spotted was the final leg of a journey that had pushed Marcus and Hound to their limits. The syndicate was still out there, their reach vast and their resources seemingly endless. But Marcus knew this was it, the end game. They had the evidence, they had a plan, and they had nothing left to lose. As the truck rumbled down the quiet streets of the town, Marcus felt a strange sense of calm. The chaos of the past few days had been overwhelming, but now, with the end in sight, he felt focused. This was what he had been trained for, not just as a SEAL, but as a man who refused to back down in the face of injustice. Hound broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "You ready for this?" Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, let's finish this." But Marcus knew this wasn't the end. The syndicate was vast, and there were still others out there. But they had dealt a major blow, and they had the evidence they needed to bring them down. The next morning, the news broke. The syndicate's crimes were front-page news, their secrets laid bare for the world to see. The organization was in chaos, their leaders scrambling to contain the fallout. Marcus and Hound watched from a distance, their faces grim but determined. They had done what they set out to do, but they knew the fight wasn't over. The syndicate would regroup, and they would come after them. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He was a SEAL, and SEALs didn't back down from a fight. And this fight was far from over. Did Marcus and Hound truly bring down the syndicate, or is the fight far from over? If you were on the edge of your seat following this gripping tale of courage, betrayal, and justice, don't stop now. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another heart-pounding story. The battle against corruption isn't over. Stay tuned for what's next.